So you've all heard me go on about Section 230 and how important it is. This is a really good article. I'm just going to read out some highlights. I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but it's really well written from Chris Cox. He was the guy who basically wrote Section 230 with Ron Wyden. And if you're wondering why it's a part of the Communications Decency Act, which was this horrible attempt to censor pornography on the internet, this is the story. This is the thing you need to read if you want to know, why Section 230 exists and what it's supposed to do, and debunk a lot of the myths going on about it. So, this is from Cox himself. It says, a new wave of regulatory fervor is rippling through Congress as representatives and senators alike search for ways to control online content they find offensive. It's all reminiscent of the debate that took place at the birth of the internet a quarter century ago. Yeah, so much of what's going on now is reminiscent of, like when I was growing up in the 70s, it was like, Bugs Bunny cartoons are too violent, so we have to, cut out all the times when, Elmer Fudd shoots his gun or anything like that. And now what have they done? The new Looney Tunes. Elmer doesn't have a gun. He has a scythe. How is that better? Anyway, it's just, the players are different. They're over on the left instead of there, but it's the same thing. It's the same kind of Calvinism we've been having to put up with for centuries. Nothing changes. So he talks about James Exon, a little-known senator from Nebraska. He's the guy behind the Communications Decency Act, the horrible stuff. He advanced a proposal for federal regulation of every user of the internet and almost everyone else involved in its architecture and delivery. Dubbed the Communications Decency Act, his legislation would have placed the federal government in the role of speech police, threatening every user of the internet and internet service providers alike with fines and prison for posting content that was constitutionally protected. Yeah, I mean, he's going to go on with this, but yeah, it's a complete violation of free speech. Exxon's bad idea briefly became law in 1996, but thankfully never took effect because the federal courts and eventually the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. That should have been the end of the story. Amid today's resurgence of support for government regulation of online content, however, the neo-regulators are resurrecting Senator Exxon's memory, or at least their revisionist version of it. They want to repeal existing federal law, known colloquially as Section 230, that places responsibility on users who post illegal content and instead shift the blame to the website or social media platform on which it is posted. And they're invoking Exxon's unconstitutional attempt to restrain free speech on the internet in support of the effort. And so he talks about Section 230 and how it became a part of this. So Section 230 was originally designed as a reproach of Exxon. It declared federal regulation of online speech off limits and gave internet platforms immunity from liability for their own efforts to moderate content. But the claim is now being made that the two were actually like legislative epoxy, with one part requiring the other. Since Exxon was tossed out, so the argument goes, Section 230 should not be allowed to stand on its own. And he's going to go into why this is ridiculous, but I just want to remind you of what I pointed out before. Section 230 was nothing more than the codification of common law conduit rights online. If someone uses your product or service to commit a crime, you're not responsible for that. Right? If there's a bank robbery and they use a Ford as a getaway car, Ford's not responsible. You can't sue them. And we're seeing a lot of that go away. Particularly with gun manufacturers, they're responsible for crimes people commit with their guns, which is absolutely ridiculous, but it's all because what they really want is a gun ban. We know that. And so we've seen this, taken away, with the FCC and other things like that, but the internet, thanks to Section 230, has been pretty immune to that. But of course, the would-be regulators and state cultists and all those people. So he's going into a lot of the story here. It's really well written. Yeah. So So the reality is far different from this revisionist history would have it. As the original sponsor of Section 230, I know I was there. And so this is all about pornography, about how terrible it is and how Senator Exxon was... Because they were worried about, well, mind what children might find that. We've got to protect the children. Won't someone think of the children? And so he says, again, I'm not reading out the whole story, but you really should read it because it's very well written, very enlightening. But he says, the Exxon dragnet was cast wide. Not only would the content creator, the person who posted the article or image that was unsuitable for minors, face jail and fines, the intent was to make online services and even access software providers liable as well. Meanwhile, internet service providers would be exempted from civil or criminal liability for the limited purpose of eavesdropping on customer email in order to prevent the transmission of potentially offensive material. Oh, doesn't that just sound wonderful? Doesn't that just sound exactly like the reality you want to live in? Actually, a lot of it sounds like the reality we do live in, but at least it's not as bad as it would have been if the CDA had stood. So basically, he's talking about how ignorant these people were. Of the senators who voted for his legislation, 52% had no internet connection. So, yeah, that's Congress. Legislating all sorts of things they don't know anything about. So, again, I'm skipping a lot of the story, but that's not because it's not good. It's really good. You should read through it yourself. I'm just not going to take the time to do it right now. When he says, the pornography debate, broadcast live on C-SPAN, then still a novelty, is what caught the public's attention. During that brief debate, breathless speeches conjuring lurid image of sordid sex acts overwhelmed academic points about free speech, citizens' privacy rights, and the way the internet's packet-switched architecture, which routes data without pre-established paths, actually works. The threat posed to the internet itself by Exxon's vision of a federal speech police paled into irrelevance. With millions of people watching, senators were wary of appearing as if they did not support protecting children from pornography. The lopsided final tally on Exxon's amendment to the Telecommunications Act showed it. There were 84 in favor, 16 opposed. So, sailed right through the Senate. Now, in the House, the situation was even worse. Only 26% of members had an email address. So, just try to explain things to these yahoos. Just like we're trying to do now with encryption. These people don't understand encryption. They don't understand any of it, and yet they're trying to regulate it. So, as chairman of the House Republican Policy Committee and someone who built his own computers and had been using the internet for years, I took a serious interest in the issue. This is Cox speaking. He's written this entire article. After some study of Exxon's legislation, I had already decided to write my own bill as an alternative. Fortuitously, I was a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which, on the House side, had jurisdiction over the Telecommunications Act, to which Exxon had attached his bad idea. The CDA was part of the 1996 Telecom Act. And he teamed up with Ron Wyden, and that's a name you've heard me cover before, one of the few people in Congress who actually understand something about computers. We decided to look for cutting-edge issues that would present novel and challenging policy questions to which neither we nor our colleagues would have a knee-jerk response. Then, after working together to address the particular issue with a practical solution, we'd work to educate members on both sides and work for passage of truly bipartisan legislation. It was not much longer afterward than the question of regulating speech on the internet presented itself, and Ron and I set to work. So this was bipartisan opposition to the Communications Decency Act, as I've talked about before, but people don't want to see it that way for some reason, but this is the truth of it. This is history. You can't argue with history. To avoid interfering with the essential functioning of the internet, the law would not shift that responsibility to internet platforms, for whom the burden of screening billions of digital messages, documents, images, and sounds would be unreasonable, not to mention a potential invasion of privacy. Instead, internet platforms will be allowed to act as good Samaritans by reviewing at least some of the content if they chose to do so in the course of enforcing rules against obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable content. I've talked about this before. This is what a lot of the opponents of Section 230 keep saying. It's just not true. They say, oh, well, as soon as you do moderation, as soon as you say what's allowed and what isn't, then you're a publisher and not a platform, and Section 230 doesn't apply. Wrong. Wrong. Now, it's specifically made so that websites can still do that, because they didn't want it to be a complete free-for-all on one hand, where you had to let absolutely everything stand, no matter how objectionable it was, and then on the other hand, being completely screwed down by government regulations. They didn't want that. Section 230 was written specifically to allow for the websites to moderate content as they saw fit, while still not having to worry about government regulating them and holding them responsible for what their users did. So the whole platform versus publisher thing is a complete red herring. It's completely meaningless. Oh, North Carolina weather. That's wonderful. I'll try and edit out those coughs so you won't have to deal with it. In New York, a judge held that one of the then two leading internet platforms, Prodigy, was liable for defamation. I have videos where I've covered Prodigy and CompuServe before. He's just summarizing that. Because an anonymous user of its site had claimed that an investment bank and its founder, Jordan Belfort, had committed securities fraud. The post was not defamatory. Belfort was later convicted of securities fraud, but not before Prodigy had settled the case for a substantial figure. Belfort would achieve further infamy when he became the model for Leonardo DiCaprio's character in The Wolf of Wall Street. In holding Prodigy responsible for content it didn't create, the court effectively overruled a prior New York decision involving the other major U.S. internet platform at the time, CompuServe. The previous case held that online service providers would not be held liable as publishers. In distinguishing Prodigy from the prior precedent, the court cited the fact that Prodigy, unlike CompuServe, had adopted content guidelines. So again, the idea that you've adopted content guidelines shouldn't have anything to do with whether or not you have this protection. So he says, if allowed to stand, this jurisprudence would have created a powerful and perverse incentive for platforms to abandon any attempt to maintain civility on their sites. In other words, the instant they came in and started moderating things, they would automatically be responsible for everything users posted to their sites. And I mean, that would be, well, I mean, that's kind of the stuff we're seeing today a bit, isn't it? You start saying, okay, well, maybe we find these couple of posts objectionable here, and then all of a sudden, everyone starts holding you liable for other stuff you're doing. And what he's really just going on through here is about how, he talks about Newt Gingrich and his support for Section 230 and Dick Armey, and how they're reaching out to their colleagues and trying to get this added in. Again, I'll let you read all this for yourself. But the bottom line is they got Section 230 added into the CDA, and he said, in the end, not a single representative spoke against the bill. He's talking about Section 230. The final roll call on the Cox-Wyden Amendment, that's Section 230, was 420 yeas to 4 nays. It was a resounding rebuke to the Exxon approach in his Communications Decency Act. The House then decided to pass its own version of the Telecommunications Act with the Cox-Wyden Amendment and without Exxon. So they didn't have the CDA in there. They had Section 230, but they didn't have the CDA. That is interesting, and that is good ammunition for the enemies of Section 230. So he said, then there was a sticky problem of 84 senators having already voted in favor of the Exxon Amendment. So this is what happens. The House passes one version of the bill, the Senate passes a different version with all these different amendments, then they got to get together and work out the differences and figure out what the final bill that they send to the president is going to be. And he says, the Senate negotiators, anxious to protect their colleagues from being accused of taking both sides of the equation, stood firm. They were willing to accept Cox-Wyden, but Exxon would have to be included too. And so the only way to do it was to include both of them. He said it was log rolling at its best, and so you have both the CDA and Section 230. President Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act of 1996 into law in February at a nationally televised ceremony from the Library of Congress reading room, where he and Vice President Al Gore highlighted the bills paving the way for the information superhighway of the Internet. There was no mention of Exxon's Communications Decency Act. Yep, didn't mention that part. But it didn't go ignored. If you've heard me talk about John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, this was what inspired him to do it. He's like, look, you're going to regulate us, we're going to do our own thing. And that's what we're seeing now. We've got, it didn't quite work out, unfortunately, the way Barlow said, because there are plenty of people online who are just willing to go along with whatever the government wants to do, at least as long as it matches, what they want. Their own personal politics. But yeah, there's people out there who are trying to build alternatives, build decentralized things like BitTube and Library and things like that, where you can't have this kind of censorship, you can't have this kind of regulation. It's all decentralized, so good luck with it. And he says, almost before the ink was dry and the signing pens handed out to the VIPs of the ceremony, the communications decency facet of the new law faced legal challenges. By summer, multiple federal courts had enjoined its enforcement. The following summer, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered its verdict with the same spirit that had characterized the House rejection. The court unanimously held that in order to deny minors access to potentially harmful speech, the CDA effectively suppresses a large amount of speech that adults have a constitutional right to receive and to address to one another. That burden on adult speech is unacceptable. And good for them. But there was still more. Under the Exxon approach, the High Court pointed out any opponent of particular internet content would gain broad powers of censorship in the form of a heckler's veto. Oh boy, are we seeing that kind of thing today. He or she might simply log on and inform the would-be discoursers that his 17-year-old child was also online. The standard for what could be posted in that forum, chat room, or other online context would immediately be reduced for what was safe for children to see. Yep. Good job predicting the future. Not so good at preventing it, but... In defenestrating Exxon, the court was unsparing in its final judgment. The amendment was worse than burning the house to roast the pig. It cast a far darker shadow over free speech, threatening to torch a large segment of the internet community. Its regime of governmental regulation of the content of speech is more likely to interfere with the free exchange of ideas than to encourage it. With that, Senator Exxon's bad idea died, hopefully forever. In the Supreme Court, Ron and I won the victory that had eluded us in the House-Senate conference. So yeah, this was exactly what they wanted and exactly what the House wanted as well. They wanted Section 230, and they didn't want the rest of the CDA. And I say the rest because it was actually included as part of it, as he says in his next paragraph. One irony, however, persists. When legislative staff prepared the House-Senate conference report on the final Telecommunications Act, they grouped both Exxon's Communications Decency Act and the Internet Freedom and Family Empowerment Act into the same legislative title. So the Cox-Wyden Amendment became Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, the very piece of legislation it was designed to rebuke. Now that the original CDA has been invalidated, it's Ron and my legislative handiwork that forever bears Senator Exxon's label. And that is unfortunate. That's why I've tried to avoid that. I've tried to say, oh, well, it's Section 230 of whatever it is, Title 43, 44. I don't remember the number. But that's probably a better way to instead of confusing it by calling it the Communications Decency Act, which it is technically, but it isn't in reality. Not by what any reasonable person would consider. But that's government for you. So now he says, in Congress, there is a noticeable resurgence of support for government regulation of content, with all that portends. This neo-regulatory mood is fueled by the same passions and concerns as it was 25 years ago, including protecting children. And that's been the excuse all along, isn't it? Although now it's child abuse material. And, oh, we can't have encryption because we need to be able to spy on content to make sure that, child abuse material isn't being, whatever. It's a lot of crap. It's just the same Calvinism. As well as the more recent trend, there's Elmer Fudd again. The more recent trend towards restricting speech that may be offensive to some segments of adults. The New York Times has fired its opinion editor, ostensibly for publishing an op-ed by a sitting Republican U.S. senator on a critical issue of the day. Supporters of the president are inflamed that Twitter is purporting to fact-check and contextualize his tweets, while progressives are inflamed that Facebook is not doing this. Senators and representatives are writing legislation that would settle these arguments through force of law rather than private ordering, including legislation to walk back the now prosaically named Section 230, which you now know the full truth about. So, the notion that the Communications Decency Act and Section 230 were conceived together is completely wrong. So is the notion that Exxon enjoyed lasting congressional support. By the time the Telecom Act completed its torturous legislative journey, support for the CDA had dwindled even in the Senate, as senators came to understand the mismatch between problem and solution that the bill represented. With the exception of its most passionate supporters, few tears were shed for the CDA at its final demise in 1997. Exxon had retired even before his law was declared unconstitutional, leaving few behind him willing to carry the torch. His colleagues made no effort to fix and replace the Exxon Amendment after the amendment was unanimously struck down by the Supreme Court. Yes, my voice is going. North Carolina weather. Gotta love it. Meanwhile, Section 230, originally introduced in the House as a freestanding bill, H.R. 1978, in June 1995, stands on its own, now as then. Its premise of imposing liability on criminals and tortfeasors for their own wrongful conduct, rather than shifting that liability to third parties, operates independently of, and indeed opposition to, Senator Exxon's approach that would directly interfere with the essential functioning of the Internet. It is also useful to imagine a world without Section 230. In this alternative world, websites and internet platforms of all kinds would face enormous potential liability for hosting content created by others. They would have a powerful incentive to limit that exposure, which they could do in one of two ways. They could strictly limit user-generated content or even eliminate it altogether, or they could adopt the anything goes model through which CompuServe originally escaped liability before Section 230 existed. We would all be very much worse off if this were to happen. Without Section 230's clear limitation on liability, it is difficult to imagine that most of the online services on which we rely every day would even exist in anything like their current form. And he concludes, whether Exxon's final bad idea of federal regulation of internet speech lives beyond him remains to be seen. The continued vitality of the internet and the choices we all have to create and access seemingly unlimited information freely and in real time will depend on the answer to that question. We can all say a prayer that the answer is no. I think that's well said, and I think the only thing left for me to say is thank you for watching. Please share this video everywhere and hit like, subscribe, and the bell because I am being shadow banned. I had my wife try it. She went on her phone in the YouTube app and looked for a couple of titles of my videos, put in the exact titles. Scroll down, scroll down, scroll down, scroll down. Less relevant videos, videos with only like, a couple dozen views. They all showed up. My video, directly relevant, didn't. She couldn't get it until she actually put in the name Shane Killian. So, don't know what's going on with that. I'm sure, I mean, I'm just a tiny channel. I'm sure it's not anything personal at me. I'm just getting, swept up in all of this, all of the crazy stuff that they're having their algorithms do that I don't even think they realize exactly what their algorithms are doing. But one way or another, it's happening, and you can do all of that so you can get all of my videos as they come up and get notified of it. I know what it's like not to be notified when you get videos from your subscriptions. It happens to me all the time. It's like, hey, that guy posted, 3 more videos in the last 2 weeks and I didn't get them. It's so frustrating. So hit the bell and you'll stop that. Share this video everywhere, especially to people you think might enjoy it. And of course, go to donate.bogosity.tv to find all the different ways that you can support this channel monetarily. Even if it's just a few pennies in cryptocurrency, it's very much appreciated. Thank you all so much. Until next time, stay strong and be free.